For our lunchtime conversation on day 2 of Widening the Pipeline, we're joined by a journalist who really rose to national prominence at about the same stage many of you in this room are at right now. Some of you obviously saw and read his bylines from Ferguson, Missouri, covering the police-related murder of Michael Brown. And I recall being, as I told you last year, I was in Nairobi, living in Nairobi at the time, and I saw an interview with Wesley Lowery. People were asking him about his experiences there, about being arrested, et cetera, et cetera. And what occurred to me in that moment was, as an African-American man covering what was literally the dawn and the birth of the so-called racial reckoning in America, he had such a unique opportunity to communicate what was going on in America during this very tense moment. Since those early days, Wesley has emerged as a leading journalist, voice, communicator, editor on so many different platforms in America. He's also been just incredibly generous to NPF and to the Widening the Pipeline family, because I think Wes has a very, very palpable connection to what it requires to be in an American newsroom. I mean, from the Washington Post to working for 60 Minutes to working with the Marshall Project, and now you're with Investigative Reporters.
Reporting Workshop.
Workshop. So it's my pleasure to give you all access to this incredible journalist and to have him give us some insights into what it's going to take specifically in this year, 2024, of what we might have in store for us as journalists, as people of color. So Wesley, thank you so much for being here today.
It's going to be a lot of fun.
I would love you to, if you could start with giving us that sort of temperature check on media today, in terms of every other day there's a headline about people being laid off. A lot of them are people of color. So if you were a 25, 24-year-old journalist today, how would you be processing what's going on right now?
Well, it would be really, really difficult, honestly. I'm in a position now, a few of my various jobs and hats involve me working with younger journalists, with students, with others, and so I actually spend a lot of time. I was at breakfast this morning with someone who I mentor, and those conversations, it's so obvious the anxiety and difficulty and frustration and fright about where we are and what's going on. Feeling that from young people, and also feeling it from my colleagues and friends, right? Some of whom are running in some of these organizations and having to administer cuts and layoffs and buyouts, or having to resign in protest, or having to. And what I will say is that the more I've been thinking about it, the more it actually reminds me a lot of the time when I was coming out of school. So I got out of school in 2012. In that era, that 2010, 11, 12, 13 era, a newspaper was closing every day. The New York Times was having to take a loan of hundreds of millions of dollars from Carlos Slim in Mexico, and would they exist? I mean, we're literally openly speculating, like, will the New York Times exist? Will every single newspaper close in the next 2 years? Was basically the conversation when I was like, I need to get a job in journalism, right? And so even as, to be clear, I think things are probably worse today than they were then, right? I just say that I can, in a lot of ways, relate to the environment in which you all have been thrust into, because I was imagining it that way as well as I kind of entered the space. I think we are in a really difficult moment, a really difficult space, because there's no way to escape the big, deep, structural, cultural issues about how we, in our society, in our democracy, how we pay or do not pay for quality news and information, right? We made a foundational decision at our founding and before our founding that our news and information ecosystem would be something that we sell on the market. And that hopefully we would do that well enough that there would be enough people willing to pay that it would support everything. And as we know, we get what we pay for. And here we are. And so it's very difficult. It's very hard, right? It's that we are all in our newsrooms and in our organizations, we're all trying to like fit a square into a circle, right? When what we have been shown kind of time and time again is that so much of what we need in terms of news and information is not the things that are the most marketable or the easiest to sell or all the times where we all go do a thing that we know we need to do so that once we get that over with, we can go do the thing we think we actually want to do or desire to do, right? All of those little trade-offs. None of that is encouraging, but what I will say is that no matter what the systems, no matter what the structures, no matter what this looks like in that big macro way, the need has not changed and will not change. We will always need people who can ask questions, who can research and report, who can explain and teach, right? The core competencies of what we do as journalists will always be necessary. The forms, the mediums, the business models, how it happens, that is going to shift and change and be different, right? And I think that for me, it is a very, I feel almost fortunate that I came out at a time when so much was breaking about what had happened previously that it made me, as much as I'm like the biggest journalism nerd in the world and have wanted to do this forever, it made me a little less nostalgic about specifics, right? There are jobs where, you know, I grew up and my greatest aspiration in life was to be like the Metro editor of the Cleveland Plain Dealer where I grew up, right? Today, that would be a job overseeing two people, basically, right? The bigness, because this whole structure has changed and shifted, right? And so again, what it forced me to do very early on was to be less romantic about I'm going to be the editor of this thing, or the status that comes with that, and to make it much more about the work. What do I want to be producing? How do I want to be thinking? And how am I open to different ideas, right? I also spent some time very early on in newsrooms with great reporters who had been around, who are at the tail end of their careers, who was a point of pride. Well, these people want me to log on for Facebook or something. I'm not doing that. And they all arrogantly did that to the unemployment lines, right? And that I was around to watch the kind of hubris around these kids and their internet. I'm a newspaper reporter. Well, that did not work very well for anyone. For thousands of people, it did not work. And so I just say all that to say that I came in at a time where the idea of podcasts didn't exist, right? So I've also watched the entire boom and bust cycle and several of them, right? There will be new technologies, new ways to tell stories, new things that happen. Everyone will decide this is the future. It'll be the future for 7 days, then it won't be. And so again, all of that to say, I would really focus on what are the skills, what are we here to do in this macro way, whether it's storytelling, informing, fact, whatever it is, and knowing that there will always be different mediums and different ways to do that, right? And being less married to the specific infrastructure of what the field used to be, or how we imagined it on day one of journalism school, might be helpful in terms of having the flexibility we all need. Some of us work in here for organizations that didn't exist on our first day of journalism school, right? We have to have the ability to imagine things we can't see yet, you know.
I believe your book, American White Lash, is on the same par as the book Caste hit me in terms of trying to understand the systemic structures of where racism and poverty and all these things come from. But when it comes to the news business, for us understanding that so much of the struggles on every level in our society are because the power structure wants to keep things the way they are. Mm-hmm. So talk to us about, translate that into the newsroom, in that one of our journalists earlier today said, what do you do when you get all of this information and you understand that your communities are changing and we need to report differently, but the gatekeepers still don't get it? Where are we in navigating that white lash in our media organizations?
I think it's really, really difficult, right? I think one of the things we have to sit with and remember, and this is very hard, I think, for us in general. And again, I am I'm like the biggest like journalism nerd and like nostalgic around all the stuff in existence, right? But what we do have to remember is that a lot of the things that, especially those of us in a room like this, want to do and why we've come into this room and what we imagine of what the press can be and should be, that's not what our newsrooms are set up to do. That was never the goal, that was never the aim, right? They were never set up to employ any of us in the first place, right? And so so there is something to be, like, we have to think about that in some ways, right? In a very literal sense, like, what was this institution designed to do? Who was it designed to inform, and in what ways? Who does it imagine its audience is? Who is it loyal to? What is its aim? What is its goal, right? What we also know is, again, how do business incentives intersect with that, right? Not to like be, I'll use, for example, it's easy to use the number one, the victors, as the example, right? Like it's of course the New York Times says its job is to inform everyone. From a literal sense, the job of the New York Times is to make the Schultzbergers more money. It is a business owned by a family. Their job is to make money for the family that owns them. Not actually to like inform democracy or hold people. That is their marketing and the means by which they think they can do that, right? And again, none of this is me questioning the great work and the great journalists there, right? But I do think for us, we have to be aware of the thing that we operate inside of, right? And the space sometimes between our like very journalism-y marketing and actually what we're being asked to do every single day. And I think sometimes our frustration comes when we, whether we can articulate it or not, are encountering that tension point. Well, I came here to do all these things that we said on the website we do. And they're like, cool, now go do this thing that makes us money. It's nice that you have all these ideas about the stuff that we're supposed to do, right? And I think there's a push and pull there, right? I think that what is also true, right, is that we have one thing that's very hard, and this is hard in any context, not just in media context, but in every institution, right? Very often the decision makers are the people who do the best at steeping themselves in the status quo. How do you become the boss? Being someone who the boss is like and who trust, right? Not necessarily by saying we're doing everything wrong, we need to do it differently. And so there can always be a tension there, right? Especially at a time and in a place where our understandings around all types of societal and cultural issues are shifting relatively quickly, right? We exist in a industry that is extremely mature and is one of the oldest industries in the country. The people running the organizations, and I don't even mean this, I don't mean in terms of their ages. We are talking about an industry in which most of the most powerful people are people decades into their careers. Right, by the very nature of that is often going to create a dissonance between what maybe you or I think is the smartest way to do this, and we're going to have different experiences, we have different memories, and I think we see that playing out in a lot of different spaces. Right? We see that playing out in all the institutions. We see that playing out in Congress. We see that playing out, and we see that especially playing out in institutions that are ostensibly integrated, diverse, that are attempting to put different people in different places. As it turns out, take a whole bunch of different people with different experiences and different backgrounds and put them in the same place, you create a whole bunch of tension, right? Like, integration is actually really messy. It actually is a little easier to have a bunch of people with broadly the same experiences and broadly the same views working together to do a task. It's a lot harder when we say, everyone's in here and we have to actually respect everyone and listen to everyone, and so and again, the idea that would be true is a very relatively modern innovation in our institution, that any of us would be in the room, much less would be listened to, would have opinions about things, or might try to do things differently. And so I think that we definitely still see that, and I think those things get aggravated even further in moments of scarcity. In moments where people are being laid off, or places are closing, or people don't know about the money, it's easy when you're drowning in cash to set up a diversity program, or to let people go to conferences, or to be extra patient when someone wants to read you the riot act about why this was the wrong thing to say. About when you're worried about, well, am I going to have the money to pay payroll next? Do I want to be sitting here with my Gen Z staff member instructing me how I use the wrong terminology for something? Maybe not, right? And I mean that in a human way for the people we work with and work for, right? And so I think all of those things are kind of coming together in this moment, right? We're at a very high tension moment in our industry, in our country, in our democracy, in our world. And that starts to trickle down into all of these different interactions and institutions.
I'm going to open it up for questions soon, but I think this is a great opportunity for me. I got a LinkedIn post from Eric Deggans about the Black Male Journalism Workshop at NYU that's starting. And over the past decade specifically, I have thought a lot about the lack of a black male presence in newsrooms. I mean, I'm an African-American woman, so everywhere I go, I see us, right? But I also spent a decade in East Africa, and in most of the newsrooms, obviously everybody was black and brown, but it was mostly men. And there were other issues of gender and whatever. But in the American context, and what we have experienced and survived over the past decade, certainly the past 5 years alone, why do we need, what's your take on why we need more black men making the calls and decisions in American newsrooms?
Well, I think that we know that there are not universal experiences, right? It's not that every man has the same experience, every black man has the same experience, every black woman has it, every woman, it's not. But we do know, in aggregate, this is the way group identity works, right, that the world sees us in certain ways and interacts with us in certain ways, right? And we respond to that, we deal with that. There are experiences some of you all have in here as women that I will just not have. I can intellectually understand. I have women in my life who can talk to me about them. I don't literally know and feel and viscerally have those experiences, and vice versa, right? And then that, as we know, the intersections of that make it even more complicated, right? And so what I think is hard is that, especially in this moment where, not in this moment, because it's been every moment of our history, right? We know, as we talk about whether it be the criminalization of black men, whether it be the stereotyping of black men, and the caricaturing of them, the ways that the media can often and does often play into those stereotypes and those ideas, we need people at the table who have a sensitivity and understanding to those things, right? Now, what is hard, right, is that we as the media, whatever that is, right, us as an institution, we are a reflection of all the prejudices and difficulties of the society we live in, right? And so it is very difficult for a black man to rise in these spaces because they're going to be seen as hostile or angry or aggressive or a womanizing brute who's going to, it's whatever the thing is, right, in a way that a white man with the same behavior might not be perceived, right? Or a black woman might not be perceived. Now, again, there are other things that would cut in other directions depending on those identities, right? But I think that I do think very often we've been missing those perspectives from our conversations. And it has been, and that part of it's been very interesting to me. I mean, I think I've worked directly for one black male editor in my career, ever. And I think that and that was one of my strongest editing relationships I've ever had, right? And I've had amazing editors who I've really appreciated it from all types of different backgrounds. But one of the things I always say is, I think, especially journalistically, like our job as journalists, to the extent possible, is to capture as accurate a picture of the world that we live in. And one of the ways we do that is we have to have a creative process that is kind of chaotic, right? Like, actually, the best way to do that is to put all of us in this room and be like, how are we writing this sentence? Because every single person will be like, well, but there's this nuance, and then, well, but and actually, at the end of that, we're going to want to kill each other at the end of it. But at the end of it, we will have the most complete version of it, right? Because we will have considered all the things, right? And unfortunately, too often, that's nothing like what our journalistic process looks like. We get a group of 10 people, 8.5 of whom have basically all the same priors, and are writing for people who they imagine are like those 8.5. And then 1.5 of us are like, well, but maybe we could add a comma, and they're like, fine, whatever, sometimes. And then that's what we spit out, right? I do actually think that journalism is a creative process. There is a messiness to it. There is a debate club aspect to it, where we do have to push and pull, and well, what about this? And what about this other thing? And is that really, it's tedious, it's annoying, it's obnoxious, right? And we also understand why, when we all have different experiences with people, it can be triggering or like, why is this white guy asking me if racism is really racism? This is annoying as hell, right? Like, why is this man questioning this experience that all these, it's all real, right? Like, but part of it's like, how do we create, in an ideal world, in the journalism we're building, because it's not the one we inhabit, how do we create a space where we have the trust and the relationships to actually do that with each other? Because our aim is, how do we, at the end, create the most rigorous, fairest, complex picture, not overly simplified, not conveniently narrative one way or the other. How do we write things that stand the test of time? 100 years from now, the aliens come down and they read it, and it's actually an accurate depiction of what was happening that day. And I think that's, and that's why you all need to be in those rooms and those spaces, and why we have to make those rooms and those spaces better habitats for you all than they are currently.
You're reminding me that one of the most powerful influences I've had in my career was Bob Magruder, at the Detroit Free Press. When I worked with him, that man forced me to take myself seriously in ways that all of the other editors that I've had couldn't do. It was his stature, it was his power, it was his sort of intellect, etc. So that's why it's so important to me.
Well, there's also this value in people who've walked down the path you have to walk down. Don't do that because they're going to look at you in this way. Or do you do that? Or whatever and there's limitations to it. There's plenty of stuff I'm going to tell you where it's like, actually, you need to learn, you need to hear what I'm trying to say, but not literally take me literally, right? And that's one of the always lessons of talking to our elders and our veterans, right? Because they are forged in a certain fire, and the fire today might be a little bit different. There's some adaptivity and there's some other, but yeah, that sense of someone in the room who for a moment at least can put themselves inside of your experience in your body, right? Knows to ask this question, knows to check in on this thing, knows to be looking around that corner for you. And again, some of us in our rooms, some people in our rooms have always had that and cannot imagine a room in which that did not exist. And many of the rest of us are like, one person who knows anything about what I'm experiencing every single day at work. And having that feeling, we can feel why it's so important.
All right, well, I have the first question. I wanted to know, like, when and how you decided that you wanted to write a book about, a very heated and complex issue. What made you feel ready to tackle it in more of a longer sort of form? I always wonder, like, how that shift happens for a reporter after covering something for a while to finally make that decision, like, I'm ready to do this in a more, like, complex or, like, a longer, more dense sort of way.
So I've got
and really contribute to it.
So I've got an answer I could give about how I would answer that now, but going back to where I was at the time, in the moment as I was making the decision, I think one thing that was true for me was I was covering this story, and I was covering it in the way it was my job to cover it, day in and day out, then doing a weekender, then maybe doing a project, and then going back to and I felt myself frustrated, as we all are, on any story, on any beat, right? We know literally nothing on day one, but write in the newspaper as if we know everything. And then by day 100, we know way more, but are still writing in the newspaper as if we know everything. Then by day 1,000, we wish we could go back to the first articles and rewrite them, because that was silly, and why did I call that person? And so for me, being in this space for so long, I felt two things. One, I now actually felt like I knew something, right? And second, I was frustrated that I was hearing from readers, especially a place like the Post, right? We got literal subscribers. I had my regulars, and it was fun. I mean, I had my regulars who would write me physical letters after every article at the time explaining to me why every black guy who'd been killed by the police actually deserved it, right? I can literally, like, every single time I knew my 4 guys who were going to write these letters, right? Or who were going to email in, or who were going to do whatever. Well, what you skipped on this one is actually, well, this guy, blah, blah, right? But also because I was writing these things and I was getting a lot of email, and the questions still seemed so simplistic in ways, and I was just like, what's the point of me doing all this if everyone still doesn't understand the basic ass answers, right? Like, I feel like I wrote this already. And then third was that I felt like there was a lot of stuff that never made out of my notebook into the pieces for any number of reasons, for structural reasons, for like the demands of what the paper wanted versus what I wanted to write. And so I finally said, well, what would it look like for me to step back and in a moment take a snapshot of everything I've learned, right? And put, like, how do I, if I truly had no self-control and really answered one of those emails fully, what would I write? And 60,000 words later, here you go, right? And what I will say is, it's at the time, I had a friend who, he said to me, who's written a few books, and he said to me, you write a book when you have something to say. Right, when there's a bigger thing to say, right? Every book, no matter how it's structured, every book is an argument. narrative is argument, research is it's all argument, right? And so you write a book when there's something to impart that is bigger and greater than the sum of its parts, right? And that was, for me, it was like I was feeling as if I was doing all these individual things. And this is a good story. This is a good tidbit. Yeah, I report. But like, what do I have to say about all this? And I think that's when I started looking in that position. What I also say now as I think about it, so now I've got 2 nonfiction books I've done. And for me, what's been interesting is these books really are snapshots of my thinking in periods of time. When I reread the first book, it takes me back to what was now almost a decade ago. And what I knew then, which is different than what I know now, how I was thinking, it puts me back in my body in that moment, right? It is an accurate snapshot of where I was, what I knew, how I was thinking, right? Who my sources were, right? Versus even now, I published this other book last June, but I finished writing it maybe in January, December, right? By the time I had published it, I had moved on beyond, right? And so it's now a snapshot of where I was then, right? And so there's some of that as well. Not everyone does it that way, right? And there are some books are much more like, this is your Great Gatsby, you work on it for 25 years, and this is your piece of art. For me, it's more been, all right, once I have something to say I feel right about, and I have the let me do it, actually knowing that book 2, I might go back and be like, well, now I've learned some more stuff. And book 4, I might go back, well, forget my first book, that was garbage, because now I know, right? Like, that there is some amount of, someone, Michael Eric Dyson, I think, said this once, that that writing is the act of thinking repetitively, of thinking more than once. You write a sentence, and then you think about it again, and then you think about it again, versus rhetoric, which is actually a performance in a way that's different, right? I'm not thinking about anything I'm saying to you, I'm just delivering it. Versus if I was writing this out, I would really be going, well, is that the right thing I want to say? Do I want to? And so I think about it that way too, right? That if part of what we do in our daily work is, by the very nature of it, much less considered, a book is in some ways the ability to now fill in some of the blanks and write between the lines and elevate. And then the next book is the ability to go back and do that again and do it again and do it again.
Hi, I'm Michael Lee from the Salt Lake Tribune. First, I want to say great to hear from fellow Ohioan and alumni of the Columbus Dispatch. But kind of going off of that, right? A lot of your early interning, and work was in local news, and you obviously made this transition to national news. And I'm curious, what the kind of biggest thing you feel like you learned or had to learn, right, during that transition, especially covering something like Ferguson.
I think that there's a very interesting, again, so much of it's audience and scope and what you're doing. I think the other thing that for me was very interesting, and I work with this a lot with younger people I work with or talk to, right? It's the sense of, we learn a lot of, this is what's very hard, I think, in general, across the field. We spend an exorbitant amount of our time learning and drilling the 101 level, and we let so few people ever actually move up to the next level. We would see this when I was at the Washington Post on the national desk. Very often I would work with our freelancers in different parts of the country or on breaking news or X, Y, and Z. And this could be someone who's been a local reporter for 40 years in a place, and the idea of what the demands are of writing this story for the front page of the Washington Post is a thing they have they've never had to write a story this way before. They've never had to think about, and again, at the technical, they know but they have no sense that the sweep is different, the scope is different, it's a different task than it was before, right? And I think that for me, what it was both going from local and doing work in these hyper-local ways, which I mean, honestly, day to day, still some of the most fun I've ever had, right? If I could go back in time and just be a city hall reporter at the Cleveland Plain Dealer, I would do that. That would actually probably be the most fun I could have day in, day out, right? That doesn't exist that way anymore. Can't do it, right? But what is interesting is as we level up and move into these different spaces, understanding the depth and complexity of different types of storytelling and different types of stories. And so I think that for me, one thing I try to do, and I think this is true anywhere, no matter where you are, no matter what space you're in, one thing that served me really well, and I did this in the Dispatch and other places, is who in here does something that I don't do and who does it really well. The Columbus Dispatch, I sat across from a guy named Randy Ludlow, who I was a crotchety old white guy who did all the public record stuff. I love writing. Right, and was like righteously indignant in all the like old newspaper ways, is constantly storming into the editor's office about something and huffing and puffing over here, right? And also, when some shit went down, Randy was roused from wherever he was and was figuring out what was going on. And this has nothing to do with his beat, but he's got the number of the person, and there was no question of who senior reporter was. When we needed something, someone's calling Randy, right? And so I'm like, I'm gonna learn everything I can from this man, right? There's not any, like, whatever he's doing, something's working here, right? Every place I've been, right, and it was helpful that Randy was extremely helpful and great, right? But it doesn't have to be someone who likes you. It doesn't have to be someone who wants to talk to you. It doesn't have to be, who's the best feature writer who doesn't have time to deal with the young person of color about, well, just read their stuff. How'd they get that? And how did they do that? What do I like about this? And how do we, one of the biggest compliments I ever got from one of my best friends, who I'd gone to college with and we moved on, we're still really good friends, but he said, he goes, I've watched your career, he goes, I can tell that you're like a student of the game, right? When you watch LeBron James after a press conference, he can't just talk about what he was supposed to do. He can talk about what every single player on the court was supposed to do in every play of the whole game. Well, there was that play in the second quarter where this person did, and he was on the bench. You didn't even think he was, that part of what we do in terms of building our expertise is understanding what's happening around us. Even if this isn't my job today, maybe I want this to be my job. Or maybe I want to know that I don't want it to be my job. So let me learn what this person does and how they do it so I can steer clear of that nonsense, right? And so I think all of those things, for me, were really important, right? I lean on stuff I learned in Columbus and Detroit and Boston and all the places every single day today. And by mastering some of that room, it was the thing that helped me now move up to the next level and then move up to the next level and then move up to the next level. And now also, by the way, I don't know what the story's going to be. I don't know what's going to happen right now, but if I need to lean back on those skills from those jobs, I know I can do them, right? It's not that I've like moved. There are some people who they move upward and never could go back down. I could do any job I've ever had and do it really well again tomorrow. And I think that is actually very helpful because it means that now as I am encountering other things, I can lean back on those skills.
Hey, Wesley. Thank you for making time for us today. You know, I happen to follow you on Twitter.
I'm sorry.
And, no. Don't apologize at all. I appreciate your presence there. And kind of leading my question, you were very bold about, while you were at the Washington Post, you were very bold about issues of race and identity there. You including really spelling out your perspective on a debate going at the paper about allowing your identity and experience to inform your work when those identities fall along the lines of gender, race,
sure,
etc. And so I just wanted to hear, I guess, at least first, what did you learn through the process of really just kind of being a more vocal and public articulator, that's not a word, of a problem a structural problem you found, in a institutional newsroom?
So I think there are two ways to answer that question. The first is that, the way my childhood trauma is set up, I have to, I can't shut up, and one, and two, I feel very, very strongly about, as someone who at times have felt like I had to claw my way up and work and do things on my own, I feel very strongly about other people not having to experience it that way. And I like to be hyper clear. I've had a lot of great mentors and people who've reached, but I take it's very important to me that we lift as we climb, right? And that I've got to have people behind me. And so for me, what was always, as I, worked my way up and gained a little more platform, more prominence, and more sway and reputation, it was very important to me that I used the privilege that came with that and the platforms that came with that to try to push and expand what would happen, right? That I was in a space where I was in the club and covered politics and could go along, and I was like, I ain't gonna move like that, right? In part also because I wasn't gonna be able to do that. But I say that to say that there was there's also a cost that comes with that. One of the things I always say is that, again, I think that this generation of journalists has really pushed and challenged our institutions in ways that we were empowered to by the people who came before us, and have been able to really publicly engage in some conversations that are not new to anyone who come from underrepresented backgrounds, but previously there weren't even enough of us in the room to do this, right? Like, and now more of us are able to do this in that way. But what I'll say is, for you all, there's a balancing act of how to think about it, right? I always say, especially when I talk like students, I'm like, don't get yourself fired out here trying to tweet what I'm tweeting, because I can't pay your rent. And I mean, and I mean that in a real, like, that we can dream together about the world we hope exists after hours when we're talking about the world as it does, right? And there is a trade-off, and there's some difficulty of figuring out what we do together to build that. And so I guess I say that to say that we do operate inside the confines of some reality. And so I'm someone who, I push and I fight. I'm willing to be outspoken. I think these conversations are important, and you all and people are picking up those torches well beyond, right? But I don't ever want to lead someone to believe that those things come without cost, and that there's not blowback. There are checks that are not in my pocket that I don't even know aren't in my pocket because of something I tweeted 8 years ago, right? Like, and that will forever be limiting in ways that I just have to be aware is true. Now, I'm fine. I'm gonna figure it out, and I'm good, right? But there is an awareness to that, and I think going in eyes open can be important.
Right, and if you're okay with it, another question is, I guess, more germane to your new book. Which I admittedly I just got handed today. I have not.
You're all good. You don't got to read it. You just got to buy it.
I'm certainly familiar with, the idea behind it, and read some interviews on it. But like you're, as I understand it, like really trying to track the arguably research. That might be a perfect nomenclature, but like arguably resurgence of hatred, and white supremacist hatred, and particularly in the United States. And so through that, you're of course using I should say of course, but using hate crime as one of the sort of apparatuses with which to understand that. But of course, as I'm sure you are far more aware of than I am. Like there are issues with even tracking hate crimes in the first place, on their own terms, but also lots of conversations among criminologists and activists about even the effectiveness of deterrence, based penalty enhancements, which of course hate crime falls into under. And I'm just curious, how do you while writing this and constructing an argument based off of, I shouldn't say based off of, but using an imperfect apparatus, how did you wrestle with telling something that you felt was still true and helpful and informative to your readers?
Well, and this is what's difficult in a lot of different ways. This is what's difficult in, again, all this is downstream of what does it mean to be a multiracial or even more broadly a diverse society of different people of different experiences, right? Because I think sometimes there can be I'm someone who is, the most important work in my career has all been data-based and data-driven and compiling and building, right? And so I hold that in hyper importance, and I actually think more often we should spend more of our media resources building things like that, because what we're doing functionally is we're inserting more facts into the public square. We answered a question. How many people are the cops killing? Well, let's answer the question, and now we have more information than we did previously, right? But I also am very aware, having been through these cycles, of how limiting that is, because we know, all the sociological research shows, people are not inclined to believe things they already don't believe, no matter what facts you put in front of them, right? That we're never going to come up with the formula that proves racism exists, where everyone's going to go, oh, good point. There's a 0% chance that one day we're going to write the analytical piece that's actually all the dudes are creeps, and the guy's going to be like, yeah, you're right, we creeps, that's right. They proved it, I saw the formula, right? We know that's not going to happen, right? And so it does become this weird catch-22, right? And I say this again, having endeavored and done this work this way, where it's I'm gonna write the piece that ends gun violence. I got this, and spoiler, didn't end gun violence, right? Didn't. And so, and none of that is to say we don't do that and endeavor in that way, but part of it is understanding the mixture and complexity of those things, right? One of the reasons we tell human stories is we understand the limitations of data. But maybe I can make you fall in love with this family, or feel terrible for them, we understand the power of anecdote. We understand that better than anything else. We saw one person on TikTok compellingly telling us a thing, and now we believe it. right? Our whole ecosystem is built on anecdote and rhetoric, right? And so now we also we build data into it, we build analytics into, all that matters a lot as well. I think we do parts of that. And I think the other thing we want to do is, and this is hard, and we're not always great, all of us, we're not always great at this, right? We have to move with that nuance and complexity. If we actually don't know the answer, we shouldn't suggest that we know it definitively, right? Well, the data says this, and the people are saying this, and like, maybe it could be these other three things we don't really know. Unfortunately, the way we have structured so much of how we as the media communicate is we are the voice of God definitively telling you the sky is blue, right? It rained or it did not. Well, that's very easy sometimes. But what we also know is that the truth is more symphonic than that. Am I speaking loudly or softly? Well, it depends. Are you sitting where you're sitting or where she's sitting? Right? Was I funny or was I inappropriately informal? So people in this room might disagree on that question, right? And neither one of them are lying. Neither of them, it's not an untruth. It's that, but the person who, it's hilarious, this thing, but was so related, that might not be the truth for someone in here, right? And I think that we always have to kind of grapple with that. So in the book, especially around I answered more broadly than the specific there, but on the idea of racial crimes, of hate, like all of it actually is remarkably difficult because what do you do? I have some cases in there. Well, what do you do when someone who has white supremacist memes on their phone gets drunk and murders a black man, but doesn't say any racial slurs while he does it? Is that a hate crime or is that not? Right? And how do you look that black family in the face and tell them that they don't, but letter of the law, what do you do? How do you do it, right? And I think we have some complexity with that, and I think our systems, our institutions, whether it be the public, whether it be the press, whether it be our court systems and our police, we're not very good at things that fall into the gray of where life is lived, right? And I think so I think as writers, we just have to be willing to lean into that a little bit. Right, to not be overly confident and to say, look, this is the part I don't know, and this is what someone could say about this, and that doesn't mean we're mealy mouthed. It doesn't mean we use euphemisms. But it means, look, fam, there's some other stuff here, and it's complicated. And I think we have to be willing to say that.
We'll take two more questions because we can keep you here all day. But go ahead.
Well, I can go. I'll try to shorten my length because I know I go.
Well, thank you for being here. I'm a journalist based in Chicago. My name's Ida Lee. And the question that I have has to do with what you mentioned earlier about this ideal that you had for your career, the job you wanted, and then having to be more open now because things change. And so do you have any advice for us about how to have career goals, be focused, while also keeping an open mind of cultural shifts, industry shifts, and just our experience so far?
Of course. I think a lot of times I think about, and again, and maybe it's because, I was saying this to someone this morning, maybe it's because of the moment when I came out, but I kind of, for whatever reason, accepted very early on, like whatever the dream is, I ain't getting there, so let me see what I can do, right? And that actually has very oddly served me in a lot of ways, because what it's meant is that in each circumstance, I'm thinking, what can I learn here? What tools am I putting in my toolbox? How does this help me learn what I don't want to do or what I do want to do? How does this put me in community with someone where now I can be like, actually, now I want to do that. I never knew I would want to do that before. And so for me, a lot of it has been, and I think what was helpful for me was I knew, and again, there's some privilege to this, right? Where it was like, I knew I wanted to do great journalism. I knew I wanted to tell stories. I knew I wanted to do it. And my understanding of what great journalism was changed context by context. That meant when I was an intern at the Columbus Dispatch, it meant I wanted my piece to be the little blurb on the front page because other intern was on Metro. And then I got up to a place and was like, all right, now I want to be the person in the Boston Press Corps who gets this little scoop instead of, all right, now I'm at the Washington Post and the person I'm sitting across from has 4 Pulitzer Prizes and is the best feature writer in the history of writing. All right, now my understanding of what journalism is has maybe changed, it's shifted a little bit, right? But in each of those senses, it's like, if I'm driving at that and I'm just trying to make sure I'm getting better day over day, month over month, right? At the end of that, I've put a lot of tools in my toolbox. I've done breaking news. I've worked a beat. I've done a feature story. I've covered a parade. And thinking of those things of how am I accumulating what's in my toolbox, because now that's going to keep more doors open for me. Right, and also, by the way, when you're sitting in one chair and all you can think about is the other chair you want to be in, you're just going to be miserable. You're just going to be miserable, right? Versus thinking like, again, there were Sunday shifts at the Boston Globe where I was hung over having to cover the Puerto Rican Day Parade. And that was not where I wanted to be. But today, I'm in a better position because of that, because of having done that job, of learned those lessons, of putting those repetitions in. You got to practice your free throws. You want to do it on the rainy Saturday, or you want to do it during the NBA Finals. Okay, at some point, you got to put these shots up. When do I want to do it? And I think that thinking about it that way is helpful, right? How do I learn as much as I can? How do I get these experiences? Because one door is going to open the next door, it's going to open the next door, and you never quite know where that's going to go.
Hey Wesley, Julian Sarapu from the Boston Globe. So I'm kind of wondering.
That was a real example, man. That I was really.
I'm not going to say I can
I got
relate.
a few weekend shifts very specifically in my mind that were rough.
But you spoke a lot about kind of institutions, right? The fact that a lot of these institutions are money-making entities and also have been around for hundreds of years, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so they're very intertwined with like the powers that be and all these other things. And I think a lot of us as journalists look at ourselves as people who are holding institutions accountable and trying to push for change in certain ways, right? Within whatever confines our job is. And you've tried to push for change in institutions that you've been a part of, right? But like, where is that cost-benefit analysis of like, okay, I'm going to push for change in this old institution that has all these connections to all these things that maybe don't agree with what I feel represents me, versus going somewhere else and trying to start from scratch or trying something more experimental, of like change from within versus without. Like, what do you think?
That's a really good question, and I'll say there's no so similar. One thing I should have said earlier to answer a different question better is that there's no two people in this field take the same pathway, right? And that's one thing to think about. Like, sometimes there's nostalgia of, well, it used to be that we would do this, then we do. Actually, if you actually drill into it, the people you want to be, they probably didn't actually take the path that way, right? And so there's value in understanding. What I have done and always did was I was like, who do I want to be? And I'm studying them like they're my beat. So they did this internship, then they went here, and then but again, it's not the literal jobs, it's what were the skills they were learning, what's the broad pathway, how did they become a feature writer? Oh, well, they did X to the X to X, right? With sports journalists, we talk about it all the time. I'll talk to a young sport, and they're like, I want to be Stephen A. Smith, or I want to be Michael Wilbot. And I'm like, word, so you're going to be a basketball beat reporter at a newspaper? Because that's where Stephen A. and Mike came from, right? That's how and a lot of times people see the destination. They don't actually see how and now I remember, my homegirl Malika Andrews, who is now the person doing that, I remember sitting down with her in Chicago when she took the Chicago Tribune beat job to talk about how to get to where that was, right? And so I say that to say, so one, there's no two people are going to take exactly the same pathway, right? Because I had to make decisions based on what was actually in front of me at the time, and what's going to actually be in front of you at the time is a different, when I was at the Boston Globe, so one of my closest friends and mentors is a man named Corey Dade. He had been a city hall, at the time he was a national reporter for NPR doing national politics. When I got hired at the Globe, he had been city hall reporter at the Globe a decade earlier. I had his same phone, the literal physical phone, right? I was in my mentor's desk in his old job, right? But there was no way but our decisions had to be totally different because it was a decade later. Everything had changed. So as it relates to how we change and think about institutions, I think there are a few different things that are true. The first is that, right, each of you are in the places you are in to learn what you have been sent there to learn. And to be clear, that might be different than what your bosses think you are sent there to do. It might be like you are here to get what you need to get out of this experience, right, and to get the most out of it. And part of that is also, you are not necessarily here to change the entire institution. Now, none of that is to say that you should not all be engaged, but remember that like your task on day 2 of work at the Boston Globe is not to force a 100-year-old institution to reckon with. No, your job is to show up and get these clips, right? Your job is to learn these lessons you need to learn. Your job is to. But the second thing I'll say about that, and I've always tried to thread this needle, right? Some of my power to have influence comes from because you all know I'm on the team, because you all know I show up. You know I'm a good colleague. You know I bust my ass. You know, right, that I'm not just in the corner like, y'all are all doing this wrong, right? We can take criticism from people who are our real friends and family and who have been there with us, because we can hear it in a way that is different, right? And I think that what we have to remember, again, is that we are outliers in these spaces. A lot of our colleagues are not used to hearing anything from people who look or sound like us, much less things that are critical, much less things that are rooted in analysis. They might just have a natural lack of comfort with some of these things, right? And they might be triggered by whatever we're saying or how we're saying it. And all of that becomes easier when they know, no, this is my colleague, they're here with me, we've worked on it, and so again, none of that is me saying pull any punches. I don't pull any punches. I can't get out of my own way with that, right? But there is something to be said for our ability to influence, right? Sometimes people have done it too far the other way, where they say, you influence through your work, you show up and you do great work, and you set a good example. I don't buy it all like that, right? Anytime anyone's trying to say that to me, it's because they want me to shut up about something, right? But when I say things, the reason it has impact is because they can't write me off as some kid on the internet. Because they have to say Pulitzer Prize winning journalist Wesley Lowery says. Right? There's not and then I go, you mean 2-time? Right? And so by the very nature, if we're going to play a credential game, we can do that, right? But that does actually mean this ain't just some crazy person out there. This is someone who, and we all have that. We're already in the room. These are our colleagues. These are our friends. These are just like in our personal relationships. If we've got to give hard truths to someone, it is easier when we have real relationship, right? It is easier when we have the ability to, and what I will also say is, and I do think we can forget this sometimes, right? There are tactics and there's strategy to it. There are times where I say some stuff in public. I got a lot of meetings I don't have in public. There are a lot of things, and there is something to be said for, don't blow your boss up on the internet if you haven't talked to them to their face yet, right? There's something to be said for the strategy and the tactics of how we move in the spaces that we move. And again, and all of that is empowered by us having the standing and the credibility, right? It's that weird space where we know in some old school they would call it meritocracy or whatever, and, other people will call it. We know that when you're the star, or that when you have the thing, or when people respect you, we know that buys you more space, right? And so part of what we're doing is, it's not just, the old black adage of working twice as hard and being twice as good, some of that, but it's also, well, so now you all at this table got to listen to me because clearly I know what I'm talking about. And I think the more we can build that, the better it is. And I think it's hard, it's a hard balance, right? But I remember what we want to think about, Corey said this to me when I was 22, 23 years old. There's a real balance between, are you a person that's speaking all the time, or are you the person when people speak, everyone listens? And and you can turn those, you can play with that knob in both directions. There are some meetings where I know I got to come in and I got to drive this. There are other meetings where I'm going to sit here real quiet, and everyone's going to talk in a circle for an hour, and at the end, I'm going to go, you know what we need to do? This, this, and this. And then we're closed. And there's always a thinking about that, right? What's our tactic? How do we get to what we actually want to get to? And there are going to be different levers we pull to do that.
Of all the brilliant insights that have been shared with us over the past hour, I think the most powerful one for me is consider our careers as a toolbox. And every experience, every interaction, everything that we are going through right now, which might feel like a challenge or not where we want to be, what we want to do is to wind up with a toolbox like Wesley Lowery, a man who is just so generous with these insights and yet so insightful for all of us as we move forward. So I'd like to take this opportunity to show Wesley our thanks for being here.
And thank you all for being here. Thanks for the work you guys are doing. And like I said, we are in some real weird times right now. But what is also true is every year of my career has been the worst year in the history of journalism. This year is not an exception to that, right? But I just say that to say that we have, as someone who does a lot of writing that is historically based, people who had far fewer resources and were less equipped, facing bigger obstacles, have overcome and done greater things. We're gonna make it through this, and also, and also any way I can ever be helpful, you all let me know. I got like 900 emails are all on the internet. I'm on all the social medias. I try not to be, but that's how I procrastinate my work. And so like send me an Instagram message or whatever. And like however I can be helpful, you all let me know. Enjoy the rest of the time you guys are here in DC. And make sure, y'all are adults, so make sure you get out and like actually have some fun and stuff. This is a really great city if you haven't been here before. Like I said, I think that you're not going to encounter anyone, certainly any person of color in this field, who hasn't really been helped by people who come in front of them. And so as a general rule, you all need to force people to be your mentors and help you, right? Ask them questions and do, like, all of that is really important. I mean, at the last thing I'll say is that when I was at the Globe, I was similar to what I was saying earlier about figuring out who's good at stuff in the room, right? The other thing I always like to think about are who are the best sources in this room. When I was at the Globe, right, I was doing breaking news and local politics. And my two best sources were the Metro columnist Adrian Walker and Kevin Cullen, right? One was the pot-bellied, dreadlocked black guy who published on Mondays and Wednesdays, and Kevin was the Irish white guy who published on Tuesdays and Thursdays. And they would both spend about 6 hours in the office and many other hours at various establishments close to the office, right? And so I would walk in and say, get my assignment for the day, and they would stroll in at 10, 11, whatever. And I walk up and I start talking, what are you working on today, Lowery? And I would start talking to them, blah, blah, blah. Oh, it's just like that thing in 97. These guys had covered local politics for 40 years. So I just got them riffing. And then the other one would come in, wait, what's Adrian telling you about blah, blah, blah? And they would say, no, who you need to call? You need to call this guy. And then I would go get lunch and spend my afternoon doing this, having all the insights of the smartest writers in the world on this. And then all my colleagues are just running around in circles not knowing what. And it's, how did you know to call the dude who oversaw the same crisis in 97? Right? How did you do? And so there's something to think about that as well, right? That we could get people invested in there are sources of information in our rooms and around our rooms. And it's not to say, again, especially in a time where things are scarce and difficult, and like, that's not to say that everyone has, but it is to say most of what we're doing, we're not in this alone. And in most cases, if I get an assignment and I think, well, actually, who'd be better at this assignment would be this person, that sounds like that's the person whose desk I should walk up to and go, how would you do this? Right? So much of what I learned was really respecting the people who do things around me and being like, how do I imitate how they do this? And sometimes that's through actual questions, and other times it's just I'm sitting here and watching. And I am on this phone call pretending to be this person. I'm scared of how to do this interview. How do I imagine this person I really admire would do this interview? Let me cosplay real quick. All right. If I had the confidence of this person, this is how I would do this interview. This is how I would imagine. I'm doing this right now with someone I'm working with who has a skill set that's different than mine. We're having to go through some very difficult managerial stuff, and she is just rock solid. And I got some hard conversations I got to have coming up, and I'm going to literally be in my head, how would she do this? What would she say? What would her face look like? And as journalists, that's something we always think about in this interview, in this writing, in this story ideas, in this, who's doing the things we want to do, and how do we learn from them?
Sounds like we have a new meme, y'all. What would Wesley Lowery do?
No, don't do that. Do the opposite of whatever that is. But I mean it. Don't be strangers. Enjoy the rest of your time in DC. And any way I can be helpful about any of it, please let me know.
And look, he means that. Out of all the people you'll meet this week, this man truly means that. So,
Yes.
thanks again.
Thank you guys.